Hilchos Beis Habechirah, Perek Sheni, the laws of the chosen house, the holy temple, chapter 2. So we have a smaller crowd today. I hope I didn't turn anybody off with yesterday's chapter. I mean, we were here, almost 2 hours. It's just so many sichas and so much commentary from the Rebbe on the first chapter, but that was just the first chapter, okay? Today and going forward, it's not going to be nearly as much. Maybe chapter 4 will have something similar to this, but we're on more easy sailing. All the Rebbe's sichas on this chapter are focused on the first 2 halachas. After that, it's pretty smooth, just learning the chapter, which we always do with success. And also at the end, something small. But definitely going to be easier and shorter than yesterday, okay? So here we go. This chapter is all about the Mizbeach. The Rambam told us yesterday that there's the temple structure, and then there's the kelim. There's the utensils that are there to service the temple. And the first one was the Mizbeach, because the Mizbeach is the main one. It's the one that basically, that's where everything goes down. The whole house was built for the sacrifices, and the altar is where you make the sacrifices. So we first talk about the Mizbeach, we got a full chapter, and then tomorrow we're going to deal with the other utensils. So let's begin. We're going to read the first 2 halachas straight, and then we'll talk about the Rebbe's commentary and insights over here. Halacha Aleph says the Rambam HaMizbeach מכוון ביותר. The Mizbeach, its place, its location was extremely exact. Not just exact, extremely exact, because the whole temple had to be on the specific mountain, Har HaMoriah, but the Mizbeach had a very specific place within that mountain. The Ein Mishanim Nesim Mimekayim Lo'ilam, we never change it from its place ever. Shanemar, as it says in the verse, V'zeh Mizbeach Lo'ila Yisrael. David HaMelech declared when he bought the property, he said, this is the Mizbeach for offerings for the Jewish people. Right? Because first he said, this is the house of Hashem. Why does he say again, this is the Mizbeach? Because he's pointing to a specific location where the Mizbeach belongs. Uva Mikdash Nekad Yitzchak Avinu. You should know, says the Rambam, that it was in the area of the Holy Temple where Yitzchak, our forefather, was bound, the famous Akedas Yitzchak. Shenemar, as it says, when God told Avram Avinu the commandment, he said, take your son, v'lech lecha el eretz HaMoriah, and go to the land of Moriah. That's where he did the whole Akedah. V'nemar b'divrei hayamim. In the Chronicles it says, v'yachel shloimei, livnei says, Beis Hashem b'Yerushalayim. Shlomo began to build the house of Hashem in Jerusalem. Behar HaMoriah, says clearly, not just in Jerusalem, anywhere. On the mountain, Asher Nira LeDavid Avihu, where Hashem had appeared to David his father. Asher Heichin Bimkaim David Begoyren Arnon Hayevusi, which he had prepared in the place of David in the threshing house of Arnon or Aravna, the Jebusite. That was the one that sold the location to King David. And King Shlomo built it in that specific place to show you that the Mizbeach has a very specific place on Mount Moriah. In a separate halacha, the Rambam continues and says, Umaseiras b'yad hakol. It is a tradition in the hands of everyone. All human people knew this, not just Jews. Shehamakim shebana bei David u'Shlomo hamizbeach b'geiren Aravna. That the place where King David and King Solomon built the Mizbeach in the threshing house of Aravna, hu hamakim shebana bei Avraham hamizbeach ve'akad alav Yitzchak. It's the exact location where Abraham built his altar and bound Yitzchak upon it. V'hu hamakim, you go back even further in history, v'hu hamakim shebana bei Noach k'sheyatza min ha-teva. It's the same place where Noach built his altar when he came out of the teva, as the Torah says, he offered sacrifices. That was right there. V'hu ha-mizbeach shehikriv alav Kain v'Hevel. Going even further back, it's the altar which Kain and Hevel, the first brothers of history, offered their sacrifices on. Ubai hikriv Adam Arishan kishanivra karban. Even further back, Adam, the first human being, when he was created, he offered a sacrifice right there. And even furthermore, umisham nivra, he was actually created from that location. Amru chachamim, in the words of our sages, Adam mimkaim kaparasai nivra, such a wonderful phenomenon that the person, the human being, was created from the location which later would become his source of atonement. So, what does the Rambam seem to be saying? The Mizbeach has a very exact place, and it's even in hallowed tradition that we know, going all the way back to the beginning of humanity, that this was the place. So, first, just 2 small points. The Rambam writes that the Mizbeach was מכוון ביותר, extremely precise. That makes it sound like the rest of the temple wasn't מכוון ביותר. But by default, if you have the Mizbeach in one place, the temple which is structured around it is also in a very precise place. So why don't we use that language about any other part of the Beis HaMikdash? Says the Rebbe, because the fact of the matter is there were changes from one temple to the other. Yes, the temple had to be built around the altar, but as for the exact dimensions and parameters, little details could have changed. So you can't say about the rest of it that it was מכוון ביותר. Not necessarily. Only the Mizbeach you can say it was actually מכוון ביותר. Another point at the end of the second halacha, and then we'll go back and discuss the whole thing. Adam mimkaim kaparasei nivra means that Adam Arishan was created from the same place where the altar later was. Now that altar, of course, was in Jerusalem, which implies that the Rambam is telling us that Adam was created in Yerushalayim. There is source for that in the Jerusalem Talmud and in the Medrash, but the classic understanding that we have is that Adam was created in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Eden, which its physical location in the beginning of time was somewhere further from Israel, somewhere in Iraq. So the Rambam seems to have ruled here not like the Babylonian Talmud, which is quite unusual. And the Rebbe went at length to prove this, but just an interesting point. The Rebbe never resolved it. Just says the Rambam clearly holds that Adam Rishon was created in Yerushalayim. Now, as far as these two halachas, I'm going to give you two different sichas. The Rebbe spent much time elaborating these two halachas on one occasion and then on a second occasion, each time with a different message. I'm going to do my best to distill both of them and deliver them as clearly as possible. So, in the first sicha, the Rebbe says like this. If you look at the structure here that the Rambam is trying to tell us, so first he tells us the Mizbeach's place. He gives us a bunch of psukim where it's proven that the Mizbeach's place was very exact. Then he gives us a whole history course, this tradition that everybody had. So the classic way to understand it is that the Rambam is explaining the place on Mount Moriah. In the first halacha, he talks about the general Mount Moriah. And then in halacha Beis, he gives us the exact placement within Mount Moriah. But that doesn't fit with the language exactly. Plus, the Rambam could have just brought that already in the first halacha. Why do you have to split it into two separate halachas? Rather, the Rambam is trying to tell us something about the importance of this place. On a simple level, you say this place of the Mizbeach is important because God chose it. That could be implied from the verses in the first halacha. Hashem made this place holy, therefore it's holy. Says the Rambam in the second halacha, you should know there's more to the story. It's also because it was a holy place for humanity. Many special things happened on this location, and that contributes to its importance. Many Achreinim write that that's actually a debate between the Rambam and the Chinuch. The Chinuch holds there's nothing else important other than God's choice. And the Rambam holds, no, it's called a Mokum Sguli. It's a place that has auspicious meaning because of things that happen there. The problem is that the psukim, the verses, do seem to imply that all that makes this place special for sacrifices is the fact that God chose it. Torah speaks of nothing of the history. So, is the Rambam ignoring that? So the Rebbe says actually no. The Rambam also agrees, and perhaps mainly holds, that the place is holy because of Hashem's choice, as I actually explained yesterday. And here we're going to get the full gamut of it. How does this work? We step back for a second. There's another argument with the Rambam and somebody else, the Rambam and the Ramban. What happened when the divine presence rested in the holy temple? Did the place become kind of related or able to hold the divine presence? Or did it just always remain a technical host, but not actually permeated the place? The Rambam holds that the place never became permeated. The Rambam writes us in Meider Nevuchim, in the Guide to the Perplexed. It never got an essential connection with the divine presence. To give a metaphor, which the Tzemach Tzedek gives, he says it's like you use your hand to write beautiful ideas. Your hand never becomes intellectual. It's just the vehicle through which you write ideas. So the temple was the vehicle through which God's presence was revealed, but it never became one or united with the place. The Ramban says the physical place changed. Just like your brain is a real host to intellect, your brain does become a vehicle, not just a vehicle through which intellect goes, but it becomes an intellectual tool. So too, the Beis HaMikdash. Seemingly, these two arguments should be dependent one upon the other. If you think that the Beis HaMikdash was special because of all the great things that happened there, so you should say that the divine presence was able to unite with it. But the Rambam seems to be taking both opposite ends. On the one hand, we're saying, at least according to the way the Achreinim understand it, that what makes the place special is the auspicious things that happened. But then he writes in Meider Nevuchim that the Shekhinah never became one or united with the place. How do we resolve that? Obviously, we have to say that Rambam holds no. That Rambam holds what makes the place special is only God's choice, as the verse says. And also you can see it in the fact that in the first halacha, he only brings verses about after Hashem's choice. What David said, what Shlomo HaMelech built, and all the special things he only brings in a separate halacha. Even what he writes about the Akedah in the first halacha is not so much to bring out that that's the specialty, just the place, because the Midrash says one of the ways they knew where the Mizbeach was because they saw the ashes remaining from Yitzchak's Akedah. So that little thing is like apprentices. The main point in Halacha Aleph is to bring out the point that Hashem chose it, and only because Hashem chose it, therefore it's holy. Which also gives a beautiful insight into why the Rambam copies down the entire verse from Divrei Hayamim. If you wanted to communicate that it was just the place where Shlomo HaMelech built it, you should just say, Pirushalayim Bahar HaMiriah. Why does he bring the end of the verse, Asher Nireh David Avihu, and that whole thing? Because he wants to communicate that that was the reason why he built it there. The reason why he built it on Har HaMiriah was only because that's where Hashem appeared to David, and otherwise it was great and Arnan HaYavusi. Besides for that, it was just a threshing house. That's all that made it special, was Hashem's appearance to David after he chose it, nothing to do with the things that happened before. And the Rambam even hints to that even in the second halacha. Even when he talks about the auspicious things, look what he says. He gives the whole history, right? Who brought it there? And then at the end he says, Amru Chachamim, the sages said, human was created from where he would be atoned for. Now everything here is from the sages. Why does the Rambam say Amru Chachamim only about the last detail that the sages said? Now, parenthetically, the Rebbe gives two answers to this question that don't go with the thrust of the Sikha. I'll just mention them in short. One answer is that perhaps this detail actually wasn't part of the Mesiras. Everybody didn't have that in their tradition. They didn't know this concept that the human was created from the place where he would be atoned for. Another possible answer is that the Rambam just wants to prove with that last line that this place of the Mizbeach is special, not just in general, but special for sacrifices. Even the fact that Adam Rishon was created there was only futuristically because that was where he was going to bring the sacrifice. So from there you see that it's like an additional kvetch, additional point that this place is special uniquely for sacrifices. But going back to the main thrust of the Sikha, the Rebbe says, perhaps this line is where the Rambam is trying to hint to us that the fact that we have all these auspicious things that happened earlier is not in contradiction to the fact that the main feature of this place is that God chose it. How so? Everybody that brought in earlier generations a sacrifice on this location did so because they were prophets and saw the choice coming later. In other words, their sacrifice was a result of the fact that the choice was going to be made later, not the choice was a result of the auspicious things. Which is why also you can explain another precise wording. In Halacha Beis, the Rambam begins in Maseidas B'yad HaKoil, Shahamokim Shabana by David Ushleimei HaMizbeach. He repeats, at the place where King David and King Solomon built the Mizbeach. He just said that in the end of the last Halacha. Why are you repeating Shahamokim Shabana by? Say Shahamokim Hazeh, this place we just talked about. Why does he say that again? Because that's the point. The point he's making is that it was that later Mizbeach that was built after the choice that caused all the other people to build their things earlier and sacrifice their sacrifice over there. Now that you can only say about human things. What about a godly intervention? If Hashem created Adam Harishon from that place, he's already in effect choosing it way before. Hashem can't do things futuristically because of the choice he's going to make later. On that, the Rambam is bringing Amru Chachamim to explain that the fact that Adam Harishon was created is not really part of this list. It's not part of the things that contributed to the specialty of the place. That was a special thing. Adam Memkom Kaparase Nivra. Hashem created him because that was going to be the place where Adam would choose to bring his sacrifice. But it didn't have any bearing on the special choice that God would make on that place. In other words, even in Halacha Beis, the Rambam is telling us that all these wonderful things that happened were because of, as a result of, the choice that Hashem made. Now, if so, why say all the things? If it's all about Hashem's choice, why do we care about all these wonderful things that happened over there? Says the Rebbe, because otherwise one could say, Hashem chose the place. Yeah, but tomorrow he'll choose something else. How do you know that when he chose the place it was to the exclusion of all others? Because in all earlier generations, everybody made sure to bring their sacrifice right there. If they knew that Hashem was going to choose the place later, and then Hashem would change his mind and choose some other place, then why would they try to bring it in this original place? Obviously because they knew that when Hashem would choose this location, it would be to the exclusion of every other location possible. And therefore, by bringing out that everyone brought the sacrifices, the Rambam is even further stressing the specialty of the place of the Mizbeach. That it was such a chosen place, such a precise place, that once it was chosen, it will never be changed. On a more mystical, deeper level, when a person does something somewhere, he invests the place with holiness. That's called Kedushah. Kedushah permeates the place. But because it's something that can permeate, that means that by definition it's a limited or a finite type of holiness. Choice invests the chosen thing with something special, not because of any quality innate to the chosen thing, but because of the chooser. And therefore it's unlimited, but it doesn't permeate. For the Rambam, it's important that the Mizbeach, this place, should have both things. Halacha Aleph tells us that because Hashem chose the place, there's an eternal thing, and it's on Hashem's terms, on infinite terms. But you should know, says the Rambam, there was also the finite Kedushah that was permeated into the place by people. And the people doing it there allowed actually in a way a bridge to be created between God's infinity and the limitation of the location. Brings together the Bechirah and the Kedushah. God's element and people's element. The ultimate harmony, the ultimate fusion of bringing heaven down to earth. In the second Sikha, the Rebbe approaches the two halachas from a bit of a different perspective. And without getting into the details, maybe we won't go through all the questions right now, just get to the main point. The Rebbe says that the two halachas are two elements of the Mizbeach's precise placement. In Halacha Aleph, the Rambam is talking about the Mizbeach as it is the main feature of the Holy Temple. As the main feature of the Holy Temple, therefore it demands a special placement, a precise placement on Har HaMoriah. And therefore, when he describes the Akedah in the first halacha, he uses the word bamikdash, which refers to the entirety of the structure, because it's talking about the Mizbeach as the main feature of the holy temple. Whereas in the second halacha, he talks about the Mizbeach. He always mentions the actual altar because it's talking about the altar in and of itself. Two separate things, the altar as part of the temple and the altar in and of itself. And that's why in the first halacha, he only brings psukim that are related to the Jewish people. Because the Mizbeach as part of the temple is a thing that belongs only to the Jewish people. Halacha Beis, he expands it to the tradition that encompasses all of humanity. All of humanity hallowed this place. And that's why the Mizbeach is a special thing even without the holy temple. Even in the Akedah itself, which is mentioned in both halachas, if you look in halacha Aleph, it says Yitzchak Avinu, Yitzchak our father of the Jewish people. Second halacha doesn't say Yitzchak Avinu, it's talking about Yitzchak as the father of humanity. The fact that this place is holy for all of humanity. Anyway, there's a lot more to it, but I'm not going to get into the details. There's another concept which the Rebbe also used to talk about in relation to this concept of Maseidas Biyad HaKol. Why do we care that everybody had a tradition where this was? Because the Jerusalem Talmud tells us that by the time the Jews came into Israel, every single mountain had been served with idol worship. So how could they build the altar? How could they build the Beis HaMikdash on this mountain? Wasn't it served? Therefore, the Rambam says, Maseidas Biyad HaKol. Everybody had a tradition that this place was special, and therefore they didn't touch this mountain with any idols. And so it remained holy for the Jewish people to offer it there, to build a temple there and to offer sacrifices there when the time came. At any rate, we're going back now to the halachas of the chapter itself. It says that Rambam halacha gimel midas hamizbeach mechuvanes harbe. The measurements, the dimensions of the Mizbeach are extremely precise. The tzurasa yedua ish me'ish, and its form is known by tradition from man to man. Umizbeach shabanu b'nei hagayla, the altar that was built by the Jews who came back to the second temple from the exile in Babylon, ke'ein mizbeach sheb asid lihibanes asuhu. They built it resembling the dimensions of the future Mizbeach in Yechezkel for the third temple. That's how they made it. And we should never detract or add to these dimensions. Halacha Dalet says that Rambam historically, there were 3 prophets that came with the Jewish people from their exile, and they were instrumental in the placement of the structure of the temple. One testified for them where the special location for the altar is. A second testified on their dimensions. And the third one testified for them that you can offer all sacrifices on this altar, even if there's no holy temple existing. Just the fact that there was a temple there at one point, King Solomon's temple, as we'll learn in chapter 6, made it holy for all time. Halacha hey, Mizbeach she'asa Moshe v'she'asa Shlomo. All 4 altars, the altar made by Moshe Rabbeinu in the desert, and the altar of King Solomon, and the altar of the second temple, and the altar which will be made in the future, kulan eser amas geva kol echad mihan, each one in the height was uniform. It was 10 amas, about 15 feet tall. The fact that in Torah it says it was only 3 amas tall in the desert, it means the tallest part, this part of the Mizbeach, the upper part, was 3 amas tall, the place where the actual firewood piles rested on. However, in the other dimensions, it was a bit different. The Mizbeach, which was made by the people who came from exile, second temple, and the one that will be built, midas arkay v'rachbay, the length and the width of it are 32 by 32 amas. Now look over here, you're looking at the entirety of the Mizbeach, including the ramp. We're not talking now about the ramp, we're talking about the square. This square, at its base, was 32 by 32 amas. Halacha Vav. Esed Amish shel Goiva HaMizbeach, returning to the height of the Mizbeach, the 10 amas of the height, mehen ba'ama bas chamisha tfachim, umehen ba'ama bas shisha tfachim. An amma is a cubit, but sometimes in Torah it's measured by being 5 handbreadths tall. Other times it's measured by being 6 handbreadths tall. It says that Rambam in the Mizbeach, it alternated. Some amas were 5 handbreadths tall, some were 6. Every other amma in the entirety of the temple structure was always a 6 handbreadth amma. But with the Mizbeach, they mixed 5 and 6. And so, it's really not fair to say 10 amas tall, because you don't know how many handbreadths there were. If they're all 6 tefach amas, that would be 60 tefachs tall. If they were all 5 tefach amas, it would be 50 tefachs tall. So the best way to say it is how many handbreadths it was, and that is, v'goiva kol ha-mizbeach shmeina v'chamishim tefach. The height of the Mizbeach was 58 tefachs as follows. V'kach hoisa midasei v'tzurasei, follow the dimensions and the form on this picture here. Ala chamisha tfachim, v'kanas chamisha tfachim, it went up 1 amma, but this amma was a 5 tefach amma, and then it went in, also 5 tefachs. Zehu yisoid, this thing was called the base. Nimtza reichav shloshim amma o shnei tfachim, al reichav shloshim amma o shnei tfachim. Since you began with an outside dimension of 32 ammas, by going in 5 tefachs on each side, you have 30 ammas and 2 tefachs left. Allah shloshim tefach, then it ascended 30 tfachim, which would be 5 ammas in the 6 handbreadth one, 6 ammas in the 5 handbreadths one. It went up 30 tefachs, the kanas chamisha tfachim, and it went in 5 handbreadths, zehu soiviv. This area now here that you have, this extension, is called the soiviv, the area which you can use to walk around the altar. Nimtzar rachbay, shmeina ve'esrim amma v'arba tfachim, al shmeina ve'esrim amma v'arba tfachim. So now it has gone in this way on both sides. So now the remaining dimension is 28 ammas and 4 handbreadths by 28 ammas and 4 handbreadths. Allah shmeina asar tfachim, then it ascended 18 more tfachim, the koines, lekeren zavis, shel hayud ches, and in the corner of these 18 tfachim, he would put in binyan cholul meruba l'chol arba krones, a little hollow square that would make up the 4 corners of the Mizbeach. Umakim akrones amma mizeh va'amma mizeh saviv, the place of this corner took up an amma by an amma, which means that now if you look at the top of the Mizbeach, you went in an extra amma. So now you have an amma thinner for the dimensions. There was a further amma indent for the Kohanim to walk around. So the actual floor of the Mizbeach where you can put firewood was reichav arba ve'esrim amma v'arba tvachim, al arba ve'esrim amma v'arba tvachim, 24 ammas and 4 handbreadths by 24 ammas and 4 handbreadths. So from a beginning base of 32 ammas by 32 ammas, you ended up by virtue of progressive indents with a floor area of 24 and a little more than half ammas by 24 and a little more than half ammas. Halacha ches, goiva kol keren v'keren chamisha tfachim. The height of every corner was 5 handbreadths tall. V'ribua kol keren amma al amma, the square of each one, we just said before, was 1 amma, 1 full amma by 1 full amma. The arba krones chalulis hayu mitoichan, each of the 4 corners was hollow on the inside. The goiva mekoim hamaracha shmeina asra tefach, and the height of this last area, the place where the floor for the firewood was on, was 18 tfachim, as we just said. Nimsa, turns out, chatzi goiva hamizbeach. If you have a total of 58 tfachim of height, the halfway point of the height of the Mizbeach, b'shisha tfachim misoif hasoiviv ulemata, is 6 tfachim down from the edge of the soiviv. And that was this red line over here that we're about to talk about right now. The chut shel sikra hayachagur be'emtza hamizbeach. They drew a line of red paint wrapping around the middle point of the Mizbeach, lahavdil bein damim ha'alyenim l'damim ha'tachteinim, to divide between the upper and lower bloods. As we're going to learn later on in this book, some sacrifices had their blood applied to the upper half of the altar, other sacrifices to the lower half of the altar. How do you know which half is which? So you have this red line by the midpoint, and that's how you know whether it's on top or on bottom. If you go with the height from the very floor till this point, not including the corners, till the place, the floor where the firewood was put, it's 9 ammas minus 1 handbreadth. V'zuhi tzurase lefimi deisov, says that Rambam, I'm going to draw for you a picture of its form. This is actually the Rambam's own hand, how he drew the picture to show you the Mizbeach. Obviously it's not to scale exactly, but it's bringing out the point of these indents that would bring up to the corners and showing you the floor area of the Mizbeach. Halacha Yud, go for a bird's eye view for a second to see the Mizbeach from on top, and you see that it's not actually a perfect square. The base didn't go around on all 4 sides of the Mizbeach like the next indent, the soiviv, did. It went all the way across the northern and the western sides. However, the oichel bedarim amma achas uve mizrach amma achas, only eating in 1 amma on this side on the east and 1 amma on this side on the south. Such that the southeastern corner over here didn't have any base at it. If you arose onto the Mizbeach on the southwestern corner, there were 2 holes resembling 2 nostrils. Now, according to the Rambam, according to many commentators, these holes were actually down here, not up here, but they were either up here or down here. There was 2 holes. They were called the shisin, which means the long pipes, where the blood would go down, mix into a water channel, which was then expelled into the river, the stream, known as the Kidron stream. Down on the floor, right on this side, right over here in the southwestern area, there was a place, an amma by an amma, with a marble board and a ring attached into it, from where you can go down and clean it out. This is its picture. That Rambam also here has a handwritten picture, which I couldn't put onto the Canva, but you can see it over here. This is the picture that the Rambam drew to describe this amma by amma area. Halacha Yud Gimel, the Kevesh hayabanu the Dreimeshal Mizbeach. There was a ramp to the south of the Mizbeach. Let's go back to this picture, you can appreciate it better. This is the south side. There was a ramp that was built attached to the Mizbeach. It was a length of 32 ammas at its base, and it had a width of 16 ammas. Though practically on the floor, it ate up a floor space of only 30 ammas because there was 2 indents. Remember, going up, 2 ammas of indent. So on the floor, it was only 30 ammas long. Because one amma had to extend over the base and one amma over the soiviv. There was a tiny little airspace between the ramp and the Mizbeach. They didn't make it fully flush to be able to throw the limbs of the sacrifices onto the fire. It says you have to throw it onto the fire. Throwing is only over airspace. So they had to make some airspace. That was considered to be a throw. The height of the ramp was in line with the floor of the woodpile area, 9 ammas less a tefach, it was from the ground, 9 ammas less a tefach, to equal to the floor of the ma'aracha. There was 2 ramps coming off of the main ramp. One you can see over here, the other one is kind of behind over here. Which would lead you to the base at the bottom over here and to the soiviv, the surrounding area. They were also right off of the Mizbeach, a hair's breadth, not fully flush with the Mizbeach. There was also a window on the west side, the inner side, maybe we can see it over here. On the west side of the kevesh, right there's that window. It was called the revuva. Whenever you had a sin offering bird that was disqualified, they would place it in that window till it was stayed overnight, and then it would be burnt. Tesvav, on the west of the ramp, also over here, there were 2 tables. One was marble, where they would place the limbs of sacrifices on there. And one was silver, where they would put all the utensils that were used in the service. When you built the Mizbeach, I know it looks like one big uniform, one big unit of stones, but it was actually built in a process as follows. It had to be built fully filled, like a pillar, with no hollow space. So how do you do that? First you would bring big and small, complete natural stones. As we learned yesterday, it has to be fully natural, no bumps. And then you would bring lime and plaster and tar and all these kinds of little pebbles. Pour it into a massive mold according to the proper measurements, and you would build it and go upwards. Now, basically is now 3 layers. There's the Yisoid, the Soiviv, and the Makam HaMa'aracha. So the Yisoid, because there was no Yisoid on the 2 sides of the south and the east, so how did you account for that? It says the Rambam, you would put in a piece of wood or stone on the southeastern sides, enough for the amount of the base that wasn't going to be there. And also when you built upwards, see, you would pour this in, fill it up with stones and tar. That would create the yisoid. Then you put the next mold on it, fill that up. Then you put the next mold on it, fill that up. So you ended up having like this on top of it, and this on top of it, till you built the entire Mizbeach. And then when it came to the corners, since the corners were hollow, you put a little bit, also a filler inside the corners, so it wouldn't fill up like a cube. It would just fill up like a square, a hollow square. So that the southeastern side would remain without a yisoid, and the corners would also be hollow. The idea of having 4 corners and the base and it being square, those are all essential features. The any altar that doesn't have a corner or a base or a ramp or being square, it's disqualified. Because all 4 elements are essential. But the height, width, and length are not essential. As long as you don't go any less than 1 amma by 1 amma by a height of 3, like the top dimensions of the Mizbeach in the desert. And the final halacha yudches Mizbeach shenifgam mibinyonai. If part of this Mizbeach's building got blemished, it's not one of the stones. If a stone got blemished, even the tiniest bump makes it disqualified. We're talking about the general building structure of the Mizbeach. Im nifgam bibinyane tefach pasul. If one handbreadth got blemished, it's disqualified. Pachas mitefach kosher. Less than that is kosher. Who, of course, provided shalayiyah banishar even peguma, that there's no any stone remaining that is blemished. Because if a stone itself gets blemished, it's disqualified. Just the building structure itself, since to begin with it's only made up of separate particles, we give it a little bit more leeway, and only once it has a tefach is it disqualified. Less than that, it's kosher.